They were 73 and 71, broke, and sleeping on a mattress in their daughter's garage when the letter arrived about a log cabin they'd inherited from a cousin they'd met only twice. Their children laughed, called it a shack in the woods, told them to sign it over and stop being a burden. But when Thomas and Margaret Brennan opened the door to that cabin and discovered what lay beneath the stone floor, hidden in an underground vault untouched for 30 years, they found something worth $265 million, and the family that had betrayed them would never see a single cent. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The fluorescent lights in the county assistant's office buzzed with the same tired rhythm as Margaret Brennan's heartbeat. She sat in a plastic chair that had seen better decades, her weathered hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced the way she'd taught her children to pray before meals a lifetime ago. Beside her, Thomas stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller, trying to take up less space in a world that had already decided he didn't matter anymore. They were waiting for their number to be called. Again. The social worker would ask the same questions, type the same answers into the same computer, and print the same rejection letter with a different date. Margaret could feel the weight of the other people in the waiting room, their sideways glances, their whispered judgments about two more old people who couldn't take care of themselves. She'd spent her whole life working, Thomas too. 52 years of marriage, 4 children raised, a small house paid off by the time they were 60. She'd been a nurse's aide for 37 years, working double shifts, holidays, weekends that bled into weeks. Thomas had been a mechanic, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his back curved from decades spent bent over engines. They'd never been rich, but they'd been proud. They'd been enough, until they weren't. The trouble started 3 years ago when Thomas had his stroke. Nothing catastrophic, the doctors said, but enough to make his hands shake when he held a wrench, enough to make driving dangerous, enough to steal the steadiness he'd relied on his entire life. Their daughter Rachel suggested, gently at first, that maybe they should move in with her, just temporarily, just until Dad got his strength back, just until they figured things out. It all sounded so reasonable, so loving, so right. They sold the house, the little 2-bedroom ranch with the oak tree in the front yard and the vegetable garden Margaret had tended for 20 years. The house where they'd raised their children, celebrated birthdays, survived losses. Rachel said it made sense. The market was good. They could put the money aside, help with expenses, maybe even leave something for the grandchildren. She'd smiled when she said it, and Margaret had wanted so desperately to believe that her daughter still cared. 6 months later, the money was gone. All $137,000 of it. Rachel's husband had lost his job, she said. They were behind on the mortgage. Could her parents help just this once? Their son Kyle needed bail money after a DUI. Could they wire $5,000? Just $5,000, and he'd pay it back within the month. He never did. Their daughter Emma had medical bills from a surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. Could they loan her $8,000? She'd cried on the phone, and Margaret's heart had broken for her. She sent the money the next day. And their youngest, Michael, sweet Michael, who'd always been the baby, called saying his business was going under. He needed capital. $20,000 would save everything. Could they help? Please? They gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. Until the bank account showed $217.33. Until Rachel's gentle suggestions turned cold. Until the phone calls stopped coming unless they were asking for more. Until the invitations to Sunday dinners dried up. Until the grandchildren stopped remembering their names. And then, when the giving finally stopped because there was nothing left, so did the love, if it had ever really been there at all. Rachel's voice on the phone turned sharp. "We can't keep supporting you. You need to find your own place, her own place." As if Margaret hadn't raised her in a home filled with warmth. As if Thomas hadn't taught her to ride a bike, to change a tire, to stand up for herself. Kyle stopped answering his phone entirely. Emma sent a text. "Sorry, things are just really tight right now," followed by radio silence. And Michael. Michael said he was too busy building his new business to visit. The business he'd started with their $20,000. Now they lived in a one-room apartment above the Golden Dragon Chinese restaurant on Elmhurst Avenue, where the walls smelled permanently of grease and soy sauce, where the heat only worked when it felt like it, where the shower pressure was so weak it took 15 minutes to rinse shampoo from Margaret's thinning hair. Thomas's Social Security check, $1,236 a month, barely covered rent. Margaret's part-time work at Save Mart grocery store when they gave her hours paid for food. Some weeks there were hours, some weeks there weren't. They'd applied for assistance, for housing, for anything that might ease the weight pressing down on their chests every single morning when they woke up and remembered what their children had done. But the system moved slowly, and they were just two more old people in a world that had run out of patience for age. Margaret's number was finally called, B-47. She stood slowly, knees protesting, cartilage worn thin after decades of standing on hospital floors. She helped Thomas to his feet, feeling how much thinner he'd gotten, how fragile. They walked to the counter together, the way they'd walked through everything together for over 5 decades, one step at a time, never letting go. The social worker, a young woman named Tiffany with kind eyes and too much mascara, smiled apologetically. Her name tag was slightly crooked. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Brennan. You're still on the waiting list for senior housing. It could be another 6 to 8 months before something opens up." Margaret nodded. She'd expected this. She'd stopped expecting good news a long time ago. "Thank you for checking. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The question was sincere, but Margaret could hear the exhaustion behind it. Tiffany probably asked that question 100 times a day. Margaret shook her head, but Thomas spoke up, his voice gravelly and soft from years of not being heard. "We're doing okay. We've had worse." The words weren't true, but Thomas had always been proud. Even now, even here, he wouldn't beg. The social worker's smile faltered for just a moment. She handed them a pamphlet about food banks and free legal aid, resources they'd already explored, already exhausted. They thanked her and left the building, stepping out into the gray October afternoon. The sky hung low and heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but never quite delivered. The air smelled like exhaust and fallen leaves. They walked slowly toward the bus stop, neither of them speaking. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said 1,000 times in the dark of their tiny apartment. When they reached their building, a 3-story brick structure with crumbling mortar and windows that rattled in the wind, there was an envelope taped to the door. Official-looking, cream-colored, thick paper stock. Addressed to Thomas and Margaret Brennan in elegant script that looked like it had been written with a fountain pen. Margaret's heart clenched. Another bill, probably. Another reminder of something they couldn't afford, another piece of paper telling them they weren't enough. Her hands trembled as she peeled the envelope from the door, careful not to tear it. Thomas watched silently. They climbed the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor, past the door that always smelled like boiled cabbage, past the apartment where someone was always yelling in a language they didn't understand. Inside their apartment, Margaret set her purse on the small table that served as both dining room and desk. She turned on the lamp with the crooked shade. Thomas sat on the edge of their bed, the mattress sagging under his weight. She opened the envelope carefully, sliding her finger under the flap. Inside was a letter on letterhead so crisp it crinkled. The logo at the top read, "Finch and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Helena, Montana." She read it once silently, her lips moving, then again, then a third time because surely she'd misunderstood. Then she handed it to Thomas without a word, afraid that speaking might make it disappear. He read it aloud, squinting in the dim light. His reading glasses had broken 2 months ago, and they couldn't afford to replace them. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, we are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiaries in the estate of Elias James Brennan, your late cousin. Mr. Brennan passed away 6 months ago at the age of 89. His estate has been finalized, and per his explicit instructions, his property located in Jefferson County, Montana, is to be transferred to you upon completion of all legal requirements. The property consists of a log cabin structure on 43 acres of forested land with mountain access. There are no outstanding debts, liens, or encumbrances of any kind. The property is free and clear. Mr. Brennan also left a small fund to cover your travel expenses should you wish to inspect the property before making any decisions regarding its future. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange transfer of the deed and discuss next steps. Sincerely, Harold Eugene Finch, Attorney at Law. Thomas looked up from the letter, his eyes wet. His voice cracked. Elias? Margaret's throat tightened. I only met him twice. Once at your mother's funeral back in 1991. He stood in the back and didn't talk to anyone. And once at that family reunion in Oregon in 1987. He was the quiet one. The one who lived out west somewhere. Never married. Never had kids. I don't think I said more than 10 words to him. Thomas folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking worse than usual. Why would he leave us anything? We barely knew him. They sat in silence, the weight of the words settling over them like snow. From below, the sounds of the restaurant filtered up through the floorboards, clanging pots, raised voices in Mandarin, the sizzle of something hitting hot oil. Outside, traffic droned past, endless and indifferent. Finally, Margaret whispered, maybe because we're the only family he had left. That evening, after a dinner of ramen noodles stretched with frozen vegetables and crackers, they sat at their tiny kitchen table and called the number on the letterhead. It rang 4 times before a man answered, his voice warm and professional. Finch and Associates, Harold Finch speaking. Thomas cleared his throat. Yes. Hello, this is Thomas Brennan. My wife Margaret and I received a letter about an inheritance from my cousin Elias. Ah, yes, the Brennans. I've been hoping to hear from you. There was the sound of papers shuffling. I'm glad the letter found you. Sometimes mail has a way of getting lost. Is the property valuable? Thomas asked cautiously, afraid to hope. We don't have much. Moving would be difficult for us. Mr. Finch paused, choosing his words carefully. Honestly? Probably not in the way you're thinking. It's remote. Very remote. No utilities hooked up, no power lines running out there. The cabin is old, built in the 1950s. It's been maintained, but it's rustic. But it's yours, free and clear. You could sell it, though I'll warn you, land out here doesn't move fast. Or you could live there. Elias did for 30-some years. He seemed happy enough. Thomas and Margaret exchanged a glance across the table. We don't have money for travel, Thomas admitted, shame creeping into his voice. Mr. Finch's tone softened. Elias anticipated that. He left a fund specifically for travel expenses, $1,500, enough to get you here, get you settled, and give you time to see the place before making any decisions. He was very particular about that. Said he wanted you to see it with your own eyes before deciding anything. Margaret leaned closer to the phone. Why us? Why would he leave us his home when he barely knew us? Another pause. Then Mr. Finch said quietly, He told me once that you were good people, that Thomas had integrity, that Margaret had kindness. He didn't elaborate, but he was very clear about his wishes. The property goes to you and no one else. They talked for another 20 minutes, Mr. Finch explaining logistics, paperwork, travel arrangements. When they finally hung up, Thomas and Margaret sat in the dark apartment, neither moving. Finally, Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you think?" Margaret stared at their joined hands, his knuckles swollen with arthritis, hers spotted with age. "I think we don't have anything left to lose." 3 days later, they told their children. Thomas called Rachel first because she was the oldest, because he still remembered the little girl who used to sit on his shoulders and point at clouds, naming their shapes. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice clipped. "Dad." "What is it?" "I'm in the middle of something." "We received some news," Thomas said. "Your mother's cousin Elias passed away. He left us some property in Montana." Silence. Then, "Property? What kind of property?" "A cabin. On some land. We're thinking about going to see it." Rachel laughed, sharp and cold. "A cabin? In Montana? Dad, that's ridiculous. You can barely walk to the mailbox. You can't handle a house in the middle of nowhere." Margaret took the phone from Thomas's hand. "We're not asking permission, Rachel. We're letting you know." Rachel's tone sharpened like a blade. "After everything we've done for you? You're going to be difficult about this? Just sign the property over to me. I'll handle the sale. We'll split the money. That's the smart thing to do." Thomas leaned close to the phone. "It's not yours to handle, Rachel." Her voice rose. "So that's how it is? You're going to be selfish? Fine. Go freeze in the woods for all I care. But don't come crying to us when you realize it's a shack with no plumbing and squirrels in the walls." She hung up. The call to Kyle was shorter. He called them ungrateful, said they owed the family after all the help they'd received. He didn't mention that the help had come from their own money. Emma didn't answer her phone at all. She texted back 3 hours later. "Busy, can't talk, hope you're okay." Michael, sweet Michael, who used to bring Margaret dandelions and called them flowers, texted a single line, "Whatever, just don't expect me to bail you out when you're homeless again." Thomas deleted the message and turned off his phone. He sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders shaking. Margaret sat beside him and pulled him close, the way she had 1,000 times over 52 years. "Let them go," she whispered. "We've already lost them. This is for us now." 2 weeks later, on a cold November morning, they stood at the Greyhound bus terminal with everything they owned packed into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. The bags were light because they didn't have much. A few changes of clothes, toiletries, photographs in a manila envelope, Margaret's Bible, spine cracked from decades of use, Thomas's toolbox, smaller now, just the essentials. They wore their warmest coats, Margaret in the navy blue wool she'd owned since 1992, Thomas in his flannel-lined denim jacket with patches on the elbows. The bus rumbled and hissed, its engine idling, exhaust curling into the gray morning. They climbed aboard slowly, Thomas gripping the handrail, Margaret supporting his elbow. They found seats near the back, away from the young people with headphones and the businessman typing furiously on a laptop. As the bus pulled away from the terminal, Margaret looked out the window one last time at the city they were leaving behind. Somewhere in those streets were 4 people who'd once called them Mom and Dad. 4 people who'd made the choice to take rather than give, to abandon rather than care. She felt the loss like a physical weight, but beneath it, something else stirred, something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The bus rumbled through Ohio, then Indiana, then Illinois. They slept in shifts, Margaret with her head on Thomas's shoulder, Thomas with his cheek pressed against the cold window. They ate gas station sandwiches wrapped in plastic, drank coffee from styrofoam cups, and watched America roll past like a film reel of everything they'd worked for and lost. Farmland stretched endless and flat, small towns blurred together, each one with the same faded storefronts and empty main streets. Then the land began to change. The flatness gave way to rolling hills, then steeper slopes. Trees grew thicker, taller. The sky opened up wider than Margaret had ever seen. By the time they crossed into Montana, 3 days into their journey, the world had transformed. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow that caught the afternoon light and blazed like fire. Rivers cut through valleys, silver and rushing. Pine forests stretched for miles, unbroken, ancient. Margaret pressed her hand against the window, feeling the cold glass, and whispered, "It's beautiful!" They reached Helena just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, like something from a painting. Mr. Finch met them at the station in a dusty pickup truck with Montana plates and a bumper sticker that read, "Keep Montana Wild." He was older than he'd sounded on the phone, maybe 70 himself, with silver hair, a weathered face, and a firm handshake. "Glad you made it," he said, helping them load their bags into the truck bed. "It's about an hour's drive to the property. Roads get rough near the end, but this old girl can handle it." He patted the truck's hood affectionately. They drove through town first, Helena spreading out in valleys between mountains, its streets lined with buildings that looked like they'd been there since the gold rush. Then they left the city behind, winding through countryside that grew wilder with every mile. The road narrowed, pavement giving way to gravel. Trees crowded closer, their branches reaching overhead like cathedral arches. The air that came through the vents smelled clean and sharp, like snow and pine and something Margaret couldn't name but felt deep in her chest. Freedom, maybe, or possibility. Mr. Finch drove with easy confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the window frame. "Elias bought this land back in 1953, he said, paid cash for it. Built the cabin himself over 2 summers. Never wanted much to do with people after that, kept to himself mostly. But he was a good man, honest, fair." He paused, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "He talked about you sometimes. Not often, but when he did it was with respect. Said you reminded him of a different time, when people still kept their word." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "We barely knew him." Mr. Finch shrugged. "Sometimes blood isn't about how much time you spend together. It's about character. He saw something in you worth protecting." They turned onto a narrow dirt road that climbed into the hills, ruts and rocks making the truck bounce and sway. Branches scraped the sides. The sun had fully set now, leaving just the glow of twilight and the truck's headlights cutting through the dark. Finally, after what felt like forever, the trees opened up into a clearing, and there, bathed in the soft light of dusk, stood the cabin. It was larger than Margaret had imagined. 2 stories built from hand-hewn logs that had darkened with weather and time to a deep honey color. The roof was steep, covered in green metal that had rusted at the edges but still held strong. A stone chimney rose from the center, solid and imposing. A wide porch wrapped around the front, its railings carved with intricate patterns. Windows reflected the last light of day, glowing soft gold. Behind the cabin, mountains rose dark against the purple sky, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, low and haunting. Mr. Finch put the truck in park and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was complete. No traffic, no sirens, no voices, just wind moving through pine branches and the creak of the truck cooling. "Home," Mr. Finch said simply. Thomas and Margaret climbed out slowly, their legs stiff from days of travel. Margaret stood in the clearing, her hand pressed to her heart, and stared. Thomas moved beside her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Thomas whispered, "He lived here? Alone?" Mr. Finch nodded, pulling their bags from the truck bed. "For 37 years. He handed Thomas a single key, old and brass, worn smooth by decades of use. "It's all yours. No mortgage, no taxes owed. Elias paid everything 50 years in advance through a trust. I don't know how he managed it, but he did. There's a well out back, hand pump still works. Solar panels on the south side installed about 10 years ago, a root cellar for storage. He lived simply, but he lived well." Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do this for us?" Mr. Finch's expression softened. He said once that the world had enough takers. He wanted to leave something to people who knew how to receive with grace. He looked at them both. I'll leave you to it. There's a care package inside. Food, blankets, firewood, everything you need for the first few days. Call me if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll be back next week to finalize the paperwork. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and with a final wave drove back down the dirt road. His taillights disappeared into the trees, leaving Thomas and Margaret alone. They stood in the clearing as full darkness settled over the mountains. Stars began to appear, more stars than Margaret had ever seen, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The air was cold and clean, and when she breathed in, she felt something inside her chest uncurl, something that had been clenched tight for years. Thomas walked toward the cabin slowly, key clutched in his hand. Margaret followed. When they reached the porch, Thomas paused, his hand on the railing. The wood was solid beneath his palm, weathered but strong. He looked at Margaret. "Ready?" She nodded. Together they climbed the 3 steps to the door. Thomas slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, like it had been waiting for them. The door swung open with a soft creak and warm air rolled out, carrying the scent of wood smoke and thyme. Thomas found a switch on the wall and flicked it. Lights came on overhead, solar-powered and soft. The main room stretched before them, larger than their entire apartment had been. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes, their spines faded but cared for. A stone fireplace dominated one end, its mantel carved with patterns of leaves and birds. The furniture was simple but solid, a leather couch worn smooth, a wooden table with 6 chairs, all handmade. The floor was wide plank pine, burnished to a soft glow by decades of footsteps, and everywhere small touches that spoke of a life lived with intention. Hand-woven rugs, oil lamps filled and ready, photographs in simple frames. Margaret walked inside slowly, running her fingers along the back of a chair. She picked up one of the photographs. A younger Elias, maybe 40, standing beside the cabin in summer, holding a fishing rod. He was smiling, genuinely smiling, in a way she'd never seen in the few times they'd met. Thomas moved to the fireplace and found wood stacked neatly beside it, kindling prepared in a basket. On the mantel sat a handwritten note in careful script. "Welcome home. Make it yours. Elias." Margaret's hands shook as she read it. Thomas pulled her close, and they stood together in the center of the room, surrounded by the evidence of one man's belief in them. They spent the next hour exploring slowly, reverently. The kitchen had a wood-burning stove, a hand pump at the sink, and shelves lined with mason jars filled with preserves that somehow still looked good. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, each with a simple bed covered in quilts, each with a window overlooking the forest. In the smaller bedroom they found more of Elias's belongings, books, journals, a wooden box filled with old letters. Downstairs, in a corner they'd missed at first, was a workbench with tools hung neatly on pegboards, organized with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime building things with his hands. As night deepened outside, Thomas built a fire in the stone fireplace. The wood caught quickly, flames rising and dancing, filling the room with warmth and the smell of burning cedar. Margaret found blankets in a cedar chest, soft and heavy, smelling of lavender. They sat together on the leather couch, wrapped in quilts, watching the fire. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't cold. For the first time in longer than that, they felt safe. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its voice rising and falling like a song. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. Beside her, Thomas took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "We made it, Maggie," he whispered. She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, we did." They didn't know yet what lay hidden beneath the stone floor of this cabin. They didn't know about the vault, the fortune, the secret that would change everything. They didn't know that their children would soon come circling like vultures, or that they'd have to fight for what was rightfully theirs. They didn't know any of it. But in that moment, sitting by the fire in a cabin built by a man they'd barely known, a man who'd seen something in them worth protecting, they had enough. They had warmth, they had shelter, they had each other, and for the first time in years they had something more precious than money. They had hope. The first morning in the cabin, Margaret woke to silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. No traffic rumbling past, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no clanging pots from the restaurant below. Just quiet, broken only by birdsong filtering through the window and the soft crackle of embers still glowing in the fireplace from the night before. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, before remembering where she was. Thomas slept beside her, his breathing deep and even in a way she hadn't heard in years. The lines around his eyes seemed softer somehow, the tension in his jaw finally released. She slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and padded barefoot to the window. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed too vivid to be real. Mist hung low in the valleys between the trees, and a deer stood at the edge of the clearing, ears twitching, before bounding silently into the forest. Margaret pressed her palm against the cold glass and felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door she'd kept locked for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She went downstairs and worked the hand pump at the kitchen sink until water gushed out, clear and cold. It tasted sweet, nothing like the metallic tap water from their apartment. She found coffee in the care package Mr. Finch had mentioned, along with oatmeal, canned goods, dried fruit, and a loaf of bread that was only a day old. There was even a jar of local honey, golden and thick. She made coffee on the wood stove, the process slow and deliberate, and when Thomas came down 20 minutes later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, she handed him a steaming mug. They sat together at the wooden table, watching light spread across the room, and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Thomas said, "I slept through the night, all the way through." Margaret nodded. "Me too." When was the last time? She couldn't remember. The days that followed fell into a rhythm unlike anything they'd known. There were no schedules to keep, no bus routes to catch, no shifts to work. Instead, there was wood to split, water to pump, meals to cook slowly on the wood stove. Thomas spent hours on the porch, just sitting, watching the forest. His hands still shook, but less than before, and sometimes he'd pick up tools from Elias's workbench and just hold them, feeling their weight, remembering what it was like to build things. Margaret explored the property, walking the perimeter slowly, discovering a small stream that ran through the western edge, a grove of aspens whose leaves shimmered gold in the breeze, and the remains of what had once been a garden plot. They talked more than they had in years, not about the children or the money or the pain, about other things, about the first time they'd met at a church social in 1971, when Thomas had been too shy to ask her to dance and she'd asked him instead. About their honeymoon in Niagara Falls, when it rained the entire time and they hadn't cared. About dreams they'd set aside so long ago they'd almost forgotten them. Thomas had always wanted to learn woodworking. Margaret had wanted to paint. Maybe now there was time. But as the days turned into weeks, Margaret began to notice things about the cabin that didn't quite add up. Small things at first. The way certain floorboards sounded hollow when she walked across them. The fact that the main room seemed smaller on the inside than it should be based on the exterior dimensions. There were spaces that didn't quite make sense, gaps in the architecture that suggested something more. She mentioned it to Thomas one evening as they sat by the fire. "Do you think this cabin has a basement?" Thomas looked up from the journal he'd been reading, one of Elias's old ledgers filled with what appeared to be maintenance records. "I haven't seen stairs going down. But you're right. Something feels off about the layout." They began exploring more deliberately after that, looking for seams, for hidden doors, for anything that might explain the inconsistencies. The stone fireplace drew Margaret's attention repeatedly. It was massive, taking up nearly the entire northern wall, built from river stones fitted together with such precision that barely any mortar showed. The mantel was carved from a single piece of oak, its surface smooth and dark with age. She ran her hands over it one afternoon, feeling the carved patterns, leaves and vines, and what might have been birds. And then her fingers found something else. A small indentation, barely noticeable, hidden within the curve of a carved leaf. She pressed it. Nothing happened. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the indentation, about the hollow sound of the floors, about the way Elias had lived here for 37 years and left almost nothing personal behind except for books and tools. It didn't make sense. At 2 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs. The fire had burned down to coals, casting the room in soft red light. She lit an oil lamp and returned to the fireplace, running her hands over the stones this time, not just the mantel. Each stone was unique, some round and smooth, others angular and rough. She worked systematically, starting from the bottom left corner, pressing each one. Most were solid, immovable. But then, about 4 feet up on the right side, she found one that shifted slightly under pressure. Her heart began to pound. She pressed harder. The stone sank inward with a soft click. At first, nothing happened. Then she heard it. A grinding sound, stone against stone, coming from somewhere beneath her feet. She stepped back quickly, the oil lamp shaking in her hand. A section of the floor in front of the fireplace, perhaps 4 feet square, had separated from the rest, a hairline crack appearing where none had been before. "Thomas," she called, her voice barely a whisper. Then louder. "Thomas!" He appeared at the top of the stairs, hair disheveled, eyes wide with concern. "What's wrong? Come here, now!" He hurried down, and she pointed at the floor. "I found something." They knelt together, running their fingers along the crack. It formed a perfect square, too precise to be accidental. Thomas retrieved a crowbar from the workbench and carefully worked it into the seam. The section of floor lifted with surprising ease, revealing itself to be a heavy wooden panel disguised to match the surrounding pine. Beneath it, a set of stone steps descended into darkness. Margaret and Thomas stared at each other, the oil lamp flickering between them. "Should we?" she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. "We have to." He went first, moving carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. Margaret followed close behind, holding the lamp high. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved directly into the stone foundation of the cabin. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Margaret counted each step. 12 in total before they reached the bottom. The oil lamp's light didn't reach far, creating a small bubble of illumination in what felt like vast darkness. Thomas took the lamp from Margaret and held it higher, slowly turning in a circle. The beam caught the edge of something wooden, then metal, then the gleam of glass. As their eyes adjusted, the space began to reveal itself, and Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. They were standing in an underground chamber roughly the same size as the cabin's main room above. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by thick wooden beams that looked hand-hewn and ancient. The walls were smooth stone, fitted together with the same precision as the fireplace. But it was what filled the space that made Margaret's knees go weak. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked carefully, each one labeled with numbers and letters in neat handwriting. Shelves held leather-bound books, their spines embossed with gold lettering. There were wooden boxes of various sizes, some small enough to hold in one hand, others requiring 2 people to lift. In the far corner stood something large covered with a canvas tarp. And in the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, its surface organized with military precision. Papers lay in neat stacks. A leather journal sat open as if someone had just been writing in it. A brass lamp with a green glass shade waited to be lit. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but the dust was even, undisturbed, as if this space had been sealed and waiting. Thomas moved to the desk slowly, setting the oil lamp down carefully. He picked up the leather journal, and Margaret moved beside him, looking over his shoulder. The first page was titled in elegant script, "Private Collection and Estate Records, Property of Elias James Brennan, begun January 7, 1963, updated through September 2, 1994, not for public record." Below that, in slightly different ink, as if added later, "For Thomas and Margaret, should you choose to look. Everything here is yours now. I trust you'll know what to do. Elias." Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the page. What followed was meticulous documentation, page after page of entries listing items, dates of acquisition, prices paid, authentication certificates, and current estimated values. The handwriting was precise, each letter formed with care. 1963, April 15th, she read aloud. Landscape by Albert Bierstadt. Oil on canvas. 36 by 24 inches. Purchased from estate sale in Portland for $375. Current estimated value. She stopped, her voice faltering. "Thomas, this says $52,000. Thomas flipped ahead a few pages. His finger traced down a column. June of '64. First edition Shakespeare folio. Purchased for $800. Current estimated value. His voice dropped to a whisper. 120,000. They looked at each other in the lamplight, then back at the journal. Margaret turned more pages, faster now. Entry after entry. Paintings, sculptures, rare books, maps, coins, stamps, stock certificates, bonds. Each one documented with the same careful precision, and at the end of each entry a current estimated value that made her head spin. Thomas moved to the nearest wooden crate and carefully pried it open. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1968, was a painting. He lifted it gently, peeling back the paper. Even in the dim light of the oil lamp, the colors glowed rich and deep. It was a landscape, mountains and clouds rendered in dramatic strokes. The signature in the corner read, A. Bierstadt. "This is the one from the journal," Margaret whispered. "The one he bought for $375. They set it carefully against the desk and opened another crate. This one held a smaller painting, a portrait of a woman in 19th century dress. The style was unmistakable even to Margaret's untrained eye. Impressionist, valuable. The signature read, Mary Cassatt. Crate after crate revealed treasures. A bronze sculpture of a horse, its patina green with age. A collection of ancient coins in individual velvet cases, each labeled with its origin and date. Roman, Byzantine, Chinese. First edition books by Twain, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. A framed map from 1702 showing unexplored territories of the American West. Each item carefully preserved, documented, authenticated. Margaret moved to the shelves and found more ledgers, these ones containing what appeared to be financial records. She pulled one down, blowing dust from its cover, and opened it. Inside were stock certificates, hundreds of them, purchased in the 1960s and 70s. Companies she recognized. IBM, Apple, Microsoft. Each certificate was accompanied by a note showing purchase price and current value. Thomas found another journal, this one more personal. He opened it and began reading aloud. March 3, 1971. Attended auction in San Francisco. Purchased 3 paintings by relatively unknown artist. Total cost, $800. The art community doesn't appreciate his work yet, but I believe they will. His name is Andrew Wyeth. He flipped ahead. December of '76. Invested $10,000 in a small computer company founded by 2 young men in a garage. Foolish, perhaps, but I've learned to trust my instincts. The company is called Apple Computer. Margaret sank onto a wooden crate, her legs no longer able to support her. He knew. Somehow, he knew what would become valuable. They spent the next hour opening boxes, examining contents, cross-referencing everything with the journals. Each discovery was more staggering than the last. A complete set of Audubon's Birds of America prints. a signed letter from Abraham Lincoln, a sculpture by Rodin, gold bars stamped with dates from the 1920s, a collection of vintage wines from France, each bottle worth thousands, and bonds, so many bonds, from corporations and governments, some matured, some still accruing interest. The scale of it was impossible to grasp. Finally, Thomas returned to the main journal and flipped to the last page. There, in Elias's careful hand, was a final entry dated September 2nd, 1994, 6 months before his death. He read it aloud, his voice shaking. Final accounting as of this date. Total estimated value of collection based on current market conditions and professional appraisals completed August of this year. Paintings and sculptures, $73,200,000. Rare books and manuscripts, $18,500,000. Coins and precious metals, $42,800,000. Stocks and bonds, $112,300,000. Miscellaneous items, $18,200,000. Total estimated value, $265 million. To Thomas and Margaret Brennan, my distant cousins, and the only family who never asked me for anything. You may not understand why I've left this to you. The answer is simple. In a world of takers, you remained givers. In a time of greed, you maintained integrity. This collection represents 37 years of careful acquisition, patience, and faith that beauty and value are worth preserving. I trust you will decide wisely what to do with it. It is yours without condition or obligation. Use it to build the life you deserve. With respect and affection, Elias James Brennan. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret stared at the number Thomas had just read, trying to make it real, trying to understand what it meant. $265 million. It was incomprehensible. It was more money than existed in her reality. Thomas set the journal down carefully, as if it might shatter. He turned to Margaret, his face pale in the lamplight. Maggie, this can't be real. But it was real. The evidence surrounded them, stacked in crates, organized on shelves, documented in journals spanning 3 decades. Margaret stood on shaking legs and moved to the large object covered by the canvas tarp in the corner. She pulled the tarp away slowly, dust billowing, and revealed a glass display case. Inside, mounted on velvet, was a collection of jeweled objects, a diamond necklace that caught the lamplight and fractured it into rainbows, a ruby brooch the size of a child's palm, a sapphire ring that glowed deep blue even in the dim light. A small placard inside the case read, "Personal collection, mostly gifts I received but never wore. Estimated value, $4,700,000. Thomas joined her, staring at the case. He was a mechanic. From Seattle. How did he do this? Margaret picked up another journal from the desk, this one older, its leather cover cracked with age. She opened it randomly and found an entry from 1958, worked as accountant for Harrison & Sons for 12 years, saved 60% of every paycheck, lived below my means, studied markets, learned to recognize value before others did, moved to Montana to escape distractions. Here, I can think clearly. Here, I can build something that lasts. She turned more pages, reading entries that painted a picture of a man who'd lived with almost monastic discipline. He'd eaten simply, worn the same clothes for years, driven the same truck for decades. Every spare dollar had gone into his collection, into investments he researched meticulously. He'd traveled occasionally, always alone, to auctions and estate sales where he could buy treasures for pennies on the dollar. He'd befriended dealers who respected his knowledge and gave him first access to new acquisitions. And he'd waited, patiently, quietly, while the world changed around him and his investments grew. Another entry from 1973 saw Thomas and Margaret at Mother's funeral today. Didn't speak to them. They wouldn't remember me anyway. But I watched. saw how Thomas supported his brothers when they were too grief-stricken to stand, saw how Margaret quietly organized everything without taking credit, saw them caring for everyone else while no one cared for them. That's rare. That's worth something. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. He was watching us, even then. Thomas found another entry, this one from 1987, attended family reunion, observed Thomas and Margaret with their children. The children are entitled, spoiled, they take without gratitude. But Thomas and Margaret endure with grace. I see their exhaustion, I see their sacrifice, and I see what's coming. Those children will bleed them dry. Someone should protect them. Perhaps that someone is me. He closed the journal and looked at Margaret. He knew. 20 years before it happened, he knew. They sat together on the stone floor of the vault, surrounded by centuries of art and history and wealth, and tried to process what they'd discovered. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a deliberate act of protection by a man who'd seen their character and believed they deserved better than the fate their own children had carved out for them. Margaret's mind raced. What do we do with this? We can't just keep it. It's too much. It's too... Thomas picked up the main journal again and reread the final entry. Use it to build the life you deserve. He looked at her. Maybe that's exactly what we do. Not keep it for ourselves, but use it to build something that matters. They stayed in the vault for another 2 hours, taking inventory, reading more of Elias's journals, beginning to understand the scope of what they'd inherited. They found documentation for everything. Certificates of authenticity from renowned experts, appraisal reports from Christie's and Sotheby's, legal documents proving clear ownership. Elias had been meticulous, leaving no room for doubt or legal challenges. Everything was properly acquired, properly documented, properly theirs. As dawn began to break above ground, they climbed the stone steps back up to the cabin. Thomas closed the hidden entrance carefully, and the floor sealed itself perfectly, once again looking like nothing more than wide pine planks. They sat at the kitchen table as light filled the room, neither of them having slept, both of them trying to comprehend the night's discoveries. Margaret made coffee with hands that still trembled. Steam rose from the mugs, curling in the morning light. Thomas stared out the window at the forest, his expression distant. Finally, he spoke. We can't tell anyone. Not yet. Margaret nodded. If word gets out, if the children find out. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what would happen. Rachel, Kyle, Emma, Michael. They'd already proven what they were capable of when money was involved. This would bring them back like sharks to blood in the water. That afternoon, they walked the property together, needing to move, needing to think, needing to process. They found themselves at the small stream on the western edge, watching water flow over smooth stones. Margaret picked up a pebble and turned it over in her palm. Do you remember when the kids were little, before everything changed? Thomas nodded. I remember Rachel bringing you dandelions, Kyle building that treehouse that was more nails than wood, Emma singing in the church choir, Michael crying when his hamster died. Margaret smiled sadly. They were good kids once. What happened? Thomas took her hand. Life happened. We gave them everything, and somehow that taught them nothing. They learned that asking was easier than earning, that parents were resources to be used up. He paused. But that's not on us anymore. We did our best. Now we have to do what's best for ourselves. Over the following days, they began researching carefully, using the old desktop computer they found in Elias's study upstairs, connected to the internet via satellite. They looked up appraisers, auction houses, estate lawyers. They read about estate taxes, trusts, charitable foundations. The numbers were staggering, but so were the possibilities. They could sell the collection piece by piece, but that would take years and draw enormous attention. They could donate it to museums and take the tax benefits. They could establish a foundation and use the assets to generate ongoing income for charitable purposes. The options were overwhelming. One evening, Margaret was reading through more of Elias's journals when she found a letter tucked between pages. It was addressed to them in his handwriting but had never been sealed. She opened it carefully. "Dear Thomas and Margaret, if you're reading this, you've found the collection. I imagine you're overwhelmed, perhaps frightened, certainly confused about what to do next. Let me make a suggestion. Don't rush. Take time to understand what you have. Talk to professionals you trust. But most importantly, don't let this fortune change who you are. You are good people. That's why I chose you. The money is a tool, nothing more. Use it to build the life you want, to help others who deserve help, to create something meaningful. Don't let it become a burden. Don't let it attract those who would use you. Your children will come. I'm sorry for that, but it's inevitable. They will smell opportunity and come circling. Stand firm. This is yours, not theirs. They made their choices long before I made mine. Finally, know that I died happy knowing this collection would go to people who understand that value isn't just about price. It's about character, integrity, and the courage to do what's right even when it's hard. Build something beautiful with this. That's all I ask. Yours in trust and respect, Elias." Margaret handed the letter to Thomas, tears streaming down her face. He read it silently, his own eyes wet. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it back in the journal. He was a good man, better than we knew. Margaret nodded. And he believed in us when no one else did. They sat together as evening fell, the cabin growing dark around them, and made a decision. They would protect this inheritance. They would use it wisely. They would honor Elias's trust. But first, they needed help. Legal help. Professional help. Help from people who could guide them through the complex process of managing an estate worth $265 million. Tomorrow they would call Mr. Finch. Tomorrow they would begin to plan. But tonight they would simply sit in the home Elias had built, surrounded by his books and his tools and the quiet legacy of a life lived with purpose, and be grateful. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the darkness. The vault beneath their feet held centuries of human achievement, art and history and beauty preserved by one man's vision. And now it belonged to two people who'd lost everything and been given a second chance, not just at wealth, but at meaning, not just at survival, but at legacy. Margaret looked at Thomas in the firelight. "We're going to do right by this, aren't we?" He squeezed her hand. "We're going to do right by him, by us, and by everyone who's ever been left behind the way we were." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. "Then let's get started." The morning after they decided to seek help, Thomas and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with Mr. Finch and a pot of coffee that had gone cold. Outside, frost clung to the pine branches, and the sun struggled to break through low clouds. Mr. Finch had arrived at 8, and they'd spent the last 2 hours explaining what they'd found. Now he sat across from them, his weathered hands wrapped around his mug, his expression carefully neutral in the way lawyers learn to be when the world shifts beneath their feet. $265 million, he repeated quietly, testing the words. "And you're certain the documentation is legitimate?" Thomas nodded. "Every piece has certificates, appraisals, bills of sale. Elias kept records of everything for over 30 years. Mr. Finch leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his professional mask slipped. His voice carried something between awe and concern. "I knew Elias was eccentric, knew he was smart, but this—" He shook his head. "This changes everything. You understand that, right? Once this gets out, and it will get out, your lives will never be the same." Margaret's throat tightened. "What do we do?" "First, we lock this down legally. Airtight trust, ironclad documentation, clear chain of ownership. Second, We get professional appraisals, proper ones, from experts who can testify in court if needed. Third, we keep this quiet as long as possible." He paused. "Fourth, and I can't stress this enough, you prepare for your children to come back." Thomas's jaw clenched. "We don't want them anywhere near this." "What you want and what will happen are two different things," Mr. Finch said gently. "Money like this has gravity. It pulls people in, especially family that's already proven they're willing to take from you." Over the next week, they worked in careful secrecy. Mr. Finch brought in a colleague from Billings, a trust attorney named Patricia Ortega, who specialized in high-net-worth estates. She was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she spent 3 days in the vault, photographing, cataloging, and building an inventory that would stand up to any legal challenge. She worked with quiet efficiency, asking questions about provenance and documentation, nodding approvingly as Thomas and Margaret showed her Elias's meticulous records. "This is extraordinary," she said on the third day, sitting at Elias's desk surrounded by ledgers. "I've worked with collectors who've spent fortunes building collections half this valuable, and they didn't have a tenth of this documentation. Your cousin was brilliant." She looked at them seriously. "But you need to understand what you're facing. An estate this size will attract attention. The IRS will want their share. Auction houses will come calling. And your family." She didn't finish the sentence. That afternoon, Margaret decided they needed to understand who Elias had really been. The journals told part of the story, but there were gaps, questions about how a simple accountant from Seattle had become one of the most sophisticated private collectors in the country without anyone knowing. She mentioned it to Thomas over lunch, and he agreed. "We need context. We need to know his story if we're going to honor what he built." The next morning they drove into town, a small cluster of buildings 20 minutes down the mountain called Cedar Falls. Population 347 according to the weathered sign at the town limits. Main Street consisted of a general store, a diner, a post office, a gas station, and a small brick building that served as both town hall and library. Margaret had noticed it on their first trip through town, a handwritten sign in the window reading, "Cedar Falls Public Library, open Tuesday through Saturday 9 to 4, donations welcome." They parked Thomas's newly purchased used truck, a necessity Mr. Finch had insisted on now that they had reliable income from liquidating a few of Elias's mature bonds. The library was quiet when they entered, smelling of old paper and wood polish. Shelves lined the walls, filled with a mix of donated books and a few new releases. A desk sat near the front window, and behind it worked a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as they entered, and her face broke into a warm smile. "You must be the Brennans. I heard someone finally took over Elias's place. I'm Dorothy Chen, town librarian, historian, and general keeper of local gossip, though I prefer to call it community knowledge." Margaret smiled. "We're still settling in. We were hoping you might be able to tell us something about our cousin. We didn't know him well, and we'd like to understand who he was." Dorothy's expression softened. Elias Brennan. Now there was a man who kept to himself. "Sit, please." She gestured to 2 chairs near her desk. "Can I make you some tea?" Over the next 2 hours, Dorothy told them what she knew. Elias had arrived in Cedar Falls in 1953, a young man of 28 with a truck full of books and a determination to disappear from the world. He'd bought the land on the mountain for next to nothing, land nobody wanted because it was too remote, too steep, too difficult to develop. He'd built the cabin himself over 2 summers, living in a tent while he worked, hauling materials up the rough road in multiple trips. He kept to himself mostly, Dorothy said, pouring more tea into chipped mugs. Came to town once a month for supplies, always polite, always paid in cash, never stayed to chat. But he wasn't unfriendly, just private. She paused, sipping her tea. "I was young then, working in my father's store. I remember thinking Elias seemed sad, like he was running from something. "Do you know what?" Thomas asked. Dorothy shook her head. "He never said. But over the years, I pieced things together from the few times he did talk. He'd been an accountant in Seattle, worked for a big firm, made good money. But he told me once that he'd watched people spend their lives accumulating things that didn't matter, sacrificing relationships for status, destroying themselves for wealth they'd never enjoy. He said he wanted something different, wanted to build something that would last, something meaningful." Margaret leaned forward. "Did he ever mention his collecting?" Dorothy's eyes widened slightly. "So you found it. The collection. I wondered if it was real or just rumor." She stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder. Over the years, people in town noticed things. Deliveries to his property, large crates marked fragile, visitors who looked like they came from cities wearing expensive suits, driving fancy cars. And sometimes Elias would go on trips, be gone for weeks, and come back with that truck loaded down. We speculated, of course. Small towns do that. Some thought he was crazy, hoarding junk. Others thought maybe he was dealing in stolen goods. "And you?" Margaret asked. Dorothy smiled. "I thought he was smarter than all of us combined." She opened the folder and pulled out newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. "I saved these. Not sure why, really, except that I've always believed Elias was special. The clippings were from art magazines and financial newspapers, spanning decades. One from 1974 detailed a record sale of a Bierstadt painting. Another from 1982 discussed the rising value of American Impressionist art. A third from 1991 predicted that technology stocks would reshape American wealth. In the margins of several articles, Dorothy had made notes in pencil. Elias bought similar pieces in '63. Elias invested in Apple in '76. Elias acquired 3 Wyeths before anyone knew his name. "You tracked his investments?" Thomas asked, astonished. Dorothy shrugged. "Like I said, small town, not much else to do. And I was curious. Elias would mention things sometimes, little comments about art or markets, and I'd research them. He was always right, always ahead of the curve." She looked at them seriously. "How much did he leave you?" Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance. "Enough to change our lives," Margaret said carefully. Dorothy nodded, asking nothing more. "Then use it well. He would have wanted that." She pulled out one more item from the folder, a photograph in a cracked frame. It showed a much younger Elias, maybe 35, standing in front of his cabin. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes held something peaceful. Dorothy handed it to Margaret. "He gave me this once, years ago. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to whoever inherited his place. Said they'd want to know he'd been happy here." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. This means more than you know." They left the library with the photograph and a deeper understanding of the man who'd changed their lives. Elias hadn't been running from something. He'd been running toward something, a life of purpose and meaning on his own terms, building a legacy in secret that would outlive him. But their peaceful research came to an abrupt end 3 days later, when the storm they'd been dreading finally broke. It started with a phone call. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Thomas's cell phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "It's Kyle." They'd changed their numbers after moving to Montana, given the new ones only to Mr. Finch and Patricia, which meant someone had given Kyle the number, someone who knew where they were. Thomas answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carefully neutral. "Hello." Kyle's voice came through loud and angry. "So it's true! You're sitting on a fortune up there and you weren't going to tell us!" Thomas closed his eyes. "Who told you that?" "Doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that you've been lying to us. You said it was just a cabin, just some worthless land. But I've been doing research, Dad. I know about Elias. I know what he was, an art collector, an investor, and I know everything he owned is now yours." Kyle's voice rose. "Which means it's ours too. We're family. We have a right to that money. You have no right to anything." Thomas said quietly. You gave up that right when you took everything we had and threw us away. There was a pause, then Kyle's voice turned cold. You really want to do this? You want to go to war with your own children? Because we will fight you. We'll tie you up in court for years. We'll prove you're not competent to manage an estate like that. We'll get guardianship, and then everything you have will be ours anyway. Margaret watched Thomas's hand tighten around the phone, his knuckles white. How did you find out? Kyle laughed, bitter and sharp. You've got a neighbor, chatty lady named Dolores, who lives about 3 miles down the mountain. She mentioned to her daughter, who mentioned to a friend who happens to know Emma's husband. Small world, right? She said there've been fancy cars going up to your place. Lawyers, appraisers, people who don't belong in Cedar Falls. So I started digging, made some calls, found out Elias Brennan wasn't just some hermit. He was worth millions, maybe more. And you think that gives you claim to what he left us? Thomas asked. Kyle's voice turned cold as ice. I think you're old, Dad. I think you're not thinking clearly. I think you need your family to help you make smart decisions. And I think if you don't cooperate, things are going to get very difficult for you and Mom. We're coming up there, all of us, tomorrow, and we're going to settle this face to face. The line went dead. Thomas lowered the phone slowly, his hand shaking. They know, and they're coming. Margaret sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. How did this happen? We were so careful. Dolores, Thomas said bitterly. We've never even met her, but she's been watching, talking. He looked at Margaret with an expression she'd never seen before, not quite rage, but something close. Protective, fierce. They're not taking this from us. I don't care what they do. This is ours. Elias left it to us, and they are not taking it. They called Mr. Finch immediately. He arrived within an hour with Patricia Ortega, and they spent the afternoon preparing. Patricia reviewed the trust documents, now finalized and filed with the state. Everything goes through the trust, she explained. You're the sole trustees. Even if they somehow got a court to declare you incompetent, which they won't, the trust protects the assets. They can't touch it. But they can make our lives hell, Margaret said quietly. Patricia nodded. Yes, they can. They can file frivolous lawsuits. They can drag you through depositions and court hearings. They can leak information to the press, turn this into a media circus. She paused. Or you can meet them head on, show them you're not the fragile old people they think you are. Show them you have legal protection, professional counsel, and the will to fight. Mr. Finch added, and you won't be alone. This community might be small, but people here respected Elias. They'll respect his wishes, and they tend to protect their own. The next day arrived cold and gray, storm clouds gathering over the mountains like bruises. Thomas and Margaret spent the morning in tense silence, watching the road from the kitchen window. Mr. Finch and Patricia had offered to be there, but Thomas had declined. This is family business, he'd said. We need to face them ourselves first. At 1 p.m, 3 vehicles turned onto the property. A BMW sedan, a large SUV, a pickup truck that had seen better days. They parked in the clearing in front of the cabin, doors opening in unison like a coordinated assault. Rachel stepped out first, dressed in expensive clothes that looked out of place in the forest. Kyle followed, his face already red with anger. Emma emerged from the SUV looking uncomfortable, and Michael climbed out of the pickup, hands shoved in his pockets, not meeting anyone's eyes. Behind them, 2 more people, a man in a suit carrying a briefcase, clearly a lawyer, and a woman with a professional camera hanging around her neck. Margaret's stomach dropped. They brought a lawyer and a photographer. Thomas opened the door before they could knock. His expression was stone. What do you want? Rachel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Hello, Dad. It's good to see you too. Aren't you going to invite us in? No, Thomas said flatly. Kyle stepped forward. We're not leaving until we talk about this, about what you're hiding up here, about the fortune you inherited that rightfully belongs to all of us. "It doesn't belong to you," Margaret said, appearing beside Thomas. "It was left to us. Specifically to us. You have no claim." The lawyer stepped forward, pulling documents from his briefcase. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, my name is Gerald Thorne. I represent your children in this matter. I have here petitions for emergency guardianship based on concerns about your mental competency and your ability to manage a substantial estate. Your children believe you're being manipulated by outside parties, and they're seeking to protect both you and the family assets." Margaret felt her blood pressure spike. "We're perfectly competent, and the only people who've ever manipulated us are standing right in front of us." Rachel's mask slipped slightly, irritation flickering across her face. "Mom, don't be dramatic. We're trying to help you. You're old. You don't understand modern finance or estate management. Someone needs to step in before you make terrible decisions." "We've already made our decisions," Thomas said, "and they don't include you. What happens next will turn this quiet mountain into a battleground, reveal the true cost of family betrayal, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Kyle's face darkened. "You can't cut us out. We're your children. We're entitled to that inheritance." "You're entitled to nothing," Thomas said, his voice rising for the first time. "You took our home, you took our savings, you took our dignity, and when there was nothing left to take, you abandoned us. Now you show up demanding more? The answer is no." The lawyer interjected smoothly. "Mr. Brennan, you may feel emotional about past family disputes, but this is about legal reality. An estate valued at over $200 million requires professional management. Your children are willing to take on that burden to spare you the stress." $265 million, Margaret corrected. "If you're going to come here demanding our money, at least get the number right." Emma spoke for the first time, her voice soft. "Mom, Dad, please. We don't want to fight. We just want to be included. We're family. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It used to," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "It used to mean everything. But you taught us that family is just a word people use to justify taking what they want." Michael finally stepped forward, and for a moment Margaret saw something in his face, shame, maybe, or regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but Rachel cut him off. "This is pointless." She turned to the lawyer. "File the papers. We'll let the court sort this out." The photographer had been snapping pictures throughout the conversation, her camera clicking constantly. Thomas noticed and pointed at her. "Who is she?" Rachel smiled coldly. "Melissa works for a regional newspaper. I thought the public might be interested in a story about elderly parents hoarding a fortune while their children struggle. Imagine the headline. Couple inherits millions, refuses to share with family who cared for them for years." "You didn't care for us," Thomas said, his voice shaking now. "You used us. There's a difference." The lawyer handed Thomas a thick envelope. "These are copies of the guardianship petitions. You'll be served officially within 48 hours. I'd advise you to get legal representation, though I doubt you can afford anyone who could match our firm's resources." He smiled thinly. "We've handled cases like this before. Elderly individuals whose judgment has become impaired by age and outside influence. The courts tend to side with concerned family members." Margaret took the envelope with trembling hands. "Get off our property, now!" Rachel's composure finally cracked. "This isn't over. That money should be ours. Elias was barely even related to you. He was just some crazy old hermit who happened to have the same last name. You don't deserve what he left you, but we'll get our share, one way or another." The group climbed back into their vehicles, tires spitting gravel as they drove away. Thomas and Margaret stood on the porch until the sound of engines faded. Then Thomas sank onto the steps, his head in his hands. "They're going to destroy us." Margaret sat beside him, pulling him close. No, they're not. We're not the same people they left in that apartment above the Chinese restaurant. We're not powerless anymore. And we're not alone. She was right about the last part. Within hours of the confrontation, word had spread through Cedar Falls. Dorothy from the library called first, her voice tight with anger. Dolores just called me, bragging about how she'd helped your family reconnect. I set her straight about what kind of reconnection this was. The whole town's going to know by tomorrow that your kids are vultures. The next call came from Sheriff Tom Whitaker, a barrel-chested man in his 50s who'd grown up in Cedar Falls. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, I heard you had some unwelcome visitors today. Just want you to know I've increased patrols up your way. Anyone bothers you, day or night, you call me directly. He rattled off his personal cell number. Elias was a good man, kept to himself, but when the town needed help, he gave it quietly. Nobody knew he had money, but looking back we know who paid for the new roof on the school, who kept the library open when the county tried to close it. Your cousin took care of this community, and now we take care of his family. More calls followed. The owner of the general store offered to deliver supplies so they wouldn't have to come to town and face questions. The mechanic who'd sold them the truck offered free maintenance for life. Even Dolores called, apologizing profusely after Dorothy had apparently given her an earful about privacy and betrayal. By evening, Mr. Finch arrived with Patricia and another man, a lawyer from Bozeman named Robert Kane, who specialized in defending against frivolous guardianship claims. He was in his 40s, tall and calm, with the air of someone who'd fought bigger battles than this and won. I've reviewed the petitions your children filed, he said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. They're asking for emergency guardianship based on claims that you're isolated, vulnerable to manipulation, and showing signs of diminished capacity. It's boilerplate stuff, weak, but it can tie you up in court for months if we let it. What do we do? Thomas asked. We fight back hard and fast, Robert said. We get affidavits from medical professionals confirming your competency. We document your children's history of financial elder abuse. We show the court that you're living independently, managing your affairs responsibly, and that the real threat comes from family members with a proven track record of exploitation. He paused. And we expose their motivations. They're not concerned about your welfare. They're after money they have no legal right to. Patricia added, the trust is ironclad. Even if they somehow won guardianship, which they won't, they can't access the assets. Everything is protected. But we can make this go away faster by showing strength immediately. Over the next week, they built their case. Thomas and Margaret underwent cognitive evaluations by 2 independent psychologists, both of whom concluded they were sharp, competent, and showed no signs of diminished capacity. In fact, one psychologist noted in her report that both subjects demonstrate remarkable resilience and clear thinking despite having endured significant family betrayal and financial abuse. Dorothy provided a sworn statement about Elias's character and his deliberate choice to leave everything to Thomas and Margaret. Sheriff Whitaker documented the children's aggressive visit and intimidation tactics. The owner of the diner testified that Thomas and Margaret seemed healthier and happier than when they'd first arrived months ago. But the children fought back. Gerald Thorne, their lawyer, filed motions for expedited hearings, arguing that elderly parents in remote locations were at risk. The photographer's pictures appeared in a regional newspaper with a headline that made Margaret's stomach turn: Family Fights for Control of Reclusive Millionaire's Fortune. The article painted Thomas and Margaret as confused elderly people being manipulated by greedy lawyers, while their concerned children just wanted to protect them. It conveniently left out the part about the stolen savings and abandoned parents. Rachel did interviews, crying on camera about how she'd taken her parents in when they had nowhere else to go, how she'd sacrificed for them, how heartbroken she was that they'd turned against their own family. The performance was convincing enough that Margaret received hate mail from strangers calling her ungrateful and selfish. Kyle hired a private investigator to dig into Mr. Finch's background, looking for any connection that might suggest impropriety. Emma filed a separate claim, arguing that as the only daughter who'd been gentle and kind, she deserved at least partial inheritance. Michael remained mostly silent, which somehow felt worse than the other's aggression. The tension escalated when Rachel and Kyle tried to access Elias's old bank accounts, claiming they were joint accounts with Thomas and Margaret, and therefore subject to family oversight. They weren't, and the bank shut them down immediately, but the attempt revealed how far they were willing to go. Then came the incident that changed everything. 2 weeks after the initial confrontation, Thomas and Margaret returned from town to find someone had broken into the cabin. Nothing was stolen, but things had been moved, drawers opened, papers rifled through. The hidden entrance to the vault remained undiscovered, thank God, but the violation left them shaken. Sheriff Whitaker arrived within 20 minutes of their call. He examined the broken window, the disturbed papers, the signs of an amateur search. Professional thieves would have done this differently, he said. This was someone looking for something specific, documents maybe, bank statements, proof of assets. He looked at them seriously. Do you think your children would break into your home? Thomas's jaw tightened. A week ago I would have said no. Now? I don't know what they're capable of. The sheriff nodded. I'm going to post a deputy up here at night until this settles down. And I'm going to have a conversation with Gerald Thorne about his client's whereabouts last night. Breaking and entering is a crime, family dispute or not. That night, lying in bed with the deputy's patrol car visible through the window, Margaret turned to Thomas. They've changed, completely. Or maybe they never were who we thought they were. Thomas stared at the ceiling. I keep trying to remember when it started. When did Rachel learn to lie so easily? When did Kyle decide cruelty was strength? When did our children become people who would break into our home? Margaret had no answer. She simply held his hand in the darkness and listened to the wind move through the pines and wondered how much worse things would get before they got better. The court date was set for 3 weeks away. Both sides filed motions, counter-motions, and affidavits. The regional newspaper ran a follow-up story with more interviews from Rachel, this time focusing on how isolated and potentially unsafe the cabin was for elderly people. An advocacy group for seniors picked up the story, ironically siding with Thomas and Margaret after reading the full details and recognizing it as a clear case of family financial abuse disguised as concern. 2 days before the hearing, Michael finally called. This time Margaret answered. Mom, it's me. Her voice was cold. What do you want, Michael? There was a long pause. To tell you I'm sorry. That I know this is wrong. That I told them I wouldn't be part of it anymore. Another pause. I've withdrawn my name from the petitions. I'm not fighting you. Margaret felt something crack in her chest. Why now? Why not before they broke into our home? Before they dragged us through the mud? Michael's voice broke. Because I finally realized what we did to you. What I did. I took your money and convinced myself I deserved it because I'm your son. But I didn't deserve it. None of us did. We stole from you and then blamed you when there was nothing left to steal. His voice dropped to a whisper. Grandpa Elias saw that. He knew what we were. That's why he left everything to you and not us. And he was right. Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. What do you want me to say, Michael? I don't want you to say anything. I just wanted you to know that at least one of your children finally woke up. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know. He paused. And Mom? The others, they're not going to stop. Rachel's convinced this is their big payday. Kyle's borrowed money to pay the lawyers, thinking he'll pay it back from the settlement. They're desperate now. Please be careful. The line went dead. Margaret lowered the phone and told Thomas what Michael had said. He listened without expression, then said quietly, Too little, too late." "Maybe," Margaret replied, "but it's something." The night before the court hearing, a storm rolled in from the north, wind howling through the canyon and rain hammering the metal roof. Thomas and Margaret sat by the fire with Mr. Finch, Patricia, and Robert going over final preparations. The case was strong, everyone agreed. The documentation was overwhelming. The children's history of abuse was well established. But courtrooms could be unpredictable, especially in emotional cases involving family. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Patricia said, "you've done everything right. You've protected yourselves, built proper legal structures, and documented everything. You should be proud." Margaret stared into the flames. "I just want this to be over. I want to honor what Elias built without spending every day fighting our own children." Robert leaned forward. "After tomorrow, one way or another, things will change. Either the court dismisses their petitions and this ends, or it drags on, but you'll know where you stand." Thomas stood and walked to the window, watching lightning fork across the dark sky. His reflection in the glass looked older than he felt, worn down by weeks of tension and betrayal. "When did we lose them?" he asked no one in particular. "When did our children become strangers?" Nobody answered because there was no answer. The storm raged outside, and inside, 4 people prepared for a different kind of storm, the kind that happens in courtrooms where families tear each other apart over money and pride and wounds too deep to heal. As the fire burned down and the wind screamed through the pines, Margaret thought about Elias living alone on this mountain for 37 years. She finally understood why he'd chosen solitude. Sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you worst. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to build walls strong enough to keep them out, even when those walls are made of stone and silence and distance measured in decades. Tomorrow they would go to court. Tomorrow they would face their children across a legal divide. Tomorrow they would defend what Elias had entrusted to them. But tonight they sat in the home he'd built and tried to remember what family was supposed to mean, back before it became a weapon. Back before love turned into leverage, back before everything broke and couldn't be fixed. The storm continued through the night, and neither Thomas nor Margaret slept. The Jefferson County Courthouse was a stone building that had stood since 1923, its columns weathered by decades of Montana winters, and its halls echoing with the footsteps of every dispute, every tragedy, every resolution this small corner of the world had witnessed. Thomas and Margaret arrived at 8:30 in the morning, half an hour before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Mr. Finch and Patricia Ortega flanked them on one side, Robert Kane on the other, a wall of legal protection around 2 elderly people who'd never imagined they'd spend their 70s fighting their own children in court. The hallway outside the courtroom was already crowded. Rachel stood near the water fountain, dressed in a conservative navy suit that probably cost more than Thomas and Margaret's monthly expenses. Kyle paced near the windows, his face flushed, his tie slightly crooked. Emma sat on a bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. Michael was notably absent, true to his word about withdrawing from the case. Gerald Thorne, their lawyer, stood conferring with 2 associates, both carrying thick briefcases filled with motions and arguments designed to paint 2 elderly parents as incompetent victims in need of rescue. When Rachel spotted them, her expression shifted from worry to something harder. She didn't approach, didn't speak, just watched them with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the decades of sacrifice and love that had come before this moment. Margaret felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers. They walked to the opposite end of the hall and sat on a wooden bench that had probably witnessed 1,000 other families falling apart. Dorothy arrived at 8:45, followed by Sheriff Whitaker in full uniform, then the owner of the general store, the mechanic, and a dozen other Cedar Falls residents who'd taken the morning off to show support. They filled the benches, a quiet presence that spoke louder than words. This wasn't just about Thomas and Margaret anymore. It was about a community standing up for what was right. At 9 o'clock sharp, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. The room was smaller than Margaret had imagined, with wooden benches, a judge's bench that seemed impossibly high, and windows that let in morning light. Judge Carolyn Winters entered through a side door, her black robe crisp, her expression stern but not unkind. She was in her early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen every variation of human conflict and had learned not to be surprised by any of it. "Everyone rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Carolyn Winters presiding." They all stood. The judge settled into her chair, arranged papers on her desk, and looked out over the courtroom with eyes that missed nothing. "Be seated." She glanced at the docket. "We're here for case number 74-92, Brennan versus Brennan. Petition for emergency guardianship." She looked at Gerald Thorne. "Counselor, you filed the petition. Present your case." Thorne stood, smoothing his expensive suit. "Your Honor, we're here today because of serious concerns about the welfare of Thomas and Margaret Brennan, both in their 70s, both living in an isolated location with no immediate family support. My clients, their children, have discovered that their parents recently inherited a substantial estate valued at over $265 million, and they're concerned that their parents lack the capacity to manage such complex financial matters. Furthermore, we believe the parents are being unduly influenced by legal counsel who may have their own interests at heart." Judge Winters raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a claim. Do you have evidence of this incompetence and undue influence?" Thorne pulled out documents. "We have evidence that Thomas Brennan suffered a stroke 3 years ago that impaired his motor functions. We have testimony that both parents were living in poverty before this inheritance, suggesting poor financial management skills. We have photographs showing their isolated living conditions, and we have documented the fact that they've severed contact with their loving family since receiving this windfall, which suggests manipulation by outside parties." Robert Kane stood. "Your Honor, if I may respond." Judge Winters nodded. "Please do." Robert moved to the center of the courtroom, his presence calm and confident. "Your Honor, this isn't a case about protecting vulnerable elderly people. It's a case about adult children who see an inheritance they weren't named in and want access to money they have no legal right to." He held up a folder. "We have medical evaluations from 2 independent psychologists confirming that both Thomas and Margaret Brennan are sharp, competent, and capable of making their own decisions. We have documentation showing they're living independently and thriving. And most importantly, we have evidence that the real threat to these people comes from the very family members claiming to protect them." He handed documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. "These are bank records showing that Rachel Brennan and her siblings systematically drained their parents' savings over a 3-year period, taking approximately $137,000 under various pretenses. These are eviction notices showing that after the money ran out, the children forced their parents out of their home. These are statements from neighbors documenting that the parents were living in substandard housing, abandoned by the very children now claiming deep concern for their welfare." The courtroom went silent. Judge Winters read through the documents, her expression growing darker with each page. Gerald Thorne's face reddened. "Your Honor, those transactions were loans. Family helping family during difficult times." "Loans require repayment," Robert said. "None of these funds were ever returned. Furthermore, we have testimony from the parents themselves about the coercion and manipulation they experienced." He gestured to Thomas and Margaret. "These people gave everything to their children, and when there was nothing left to give, they were discarded. Now, because of a generous relative who saw their character and worth, they have a second chance. The children want to take that too." Judge Winters set down the papers. "I'd like to hear from the parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, please approach." Margaret's legs felt weak as she stood. Thomas gripped her hand, and together they walked to the front of the courtroom. The judge looked at them, her stern expression softening slightly. Mrs. Brennan, can you tell me in your own words what happened with your children? Margaret took a breath, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. We worked our whole lives to give them everything: food, shelter, education, love. When my husband had his stroke, our daughter said we should move in with her, said it was temporary, said she wanted to help. She paused, tears forming. We sold our home, put the money aside, but then they needed it. For bills, for bail, for medical expenses, for businesses, always for something. And we gave it because we loved them, because that's what parents do. And after the money was gone? Judge Winters asked gently. After the money was gone, Margaret said, her voice breaking, they didn't need us anymore. My daughter told us to find our own place. None of them would return our calls. We lived in a one-room apartment above a restaurant, barely scraping by. She looked directly at Rachel, who wouldn't meet her eyes. We weren't family anymore. We were just a burden they'd finally shed. Mr. Brennan, the judge said, turning to Thomas, what about the inheritance? How did that come about? Thomas cleared his throat. My cousin Elias left us his property, a cabin on some land in Montana. We barely knew him, met him maybe twice in our lives, but he left it to us, said in his will that we were good people who deserved better. He paused, his voice strengthening. We didn't know about the collection when we moved here. We found it by accident, hidden in a vault under the cabin, every piece documented, every acquisition legal and proper. Elias had spent 37 years building something meaningful, and he chose to leave it to us. Not because we asked for it, but because he trusted us to do right by it. And your children want access to this inheritance? Judge Winters asked. Thomas nodded. They showed up the day they found out, brought a lawyer, brought a photographer, threatened us with lawsuits and guardianship claims. Someone even broke into our home looking for financial documents. His voice hardened. These aren't concerned children, Your Honor. These are people who see money they think they're entitled to, but they're not. Elias was very clear about that. Judge Winters turned to Gerald Thorne. Counselor, do you have any evidence beyond the stroke and the isolation that suggests your client's parents are incompetent? Thorne shuffled papers. Your Honor, the mere fact that they're choosing to sever ties with their loving family suggests impaired judgment. What parent would cut off their own children unless they were being manipulated? A parent who'd been abused by those children, Robert interjected. Your Honor, we've established a clear pattern of financial exploitation. The children took everything and gave nothing back. Now they're using the court system to continue that exploitation under the guise of concern. It's textbook elder abuse. Judge Winters held up a hand. I've heard enough arguments. She turned to her clerk. Please retrieve the sealed documents filed by the Brennan estate attorney. There was a murmur in the courtroom. Gerald Thorne looked confused. Your Honor, I'm not aware of any sealed documents. Judge Winters smiled slightly. That's because they were filed by Elias Brennan's attorney 10 years ago with instructions to be opened only if his heirs faced legal challenges from family members. She took an envelope from the clerk and broke the seal. Inside were several documents and a letter. The judge read silently for several minutes, and as she did, her expression shifted from stern to something almost sad. Finally, she looked up. This is a letter from Elias Brennan, written in 1994 and notarized by Harold Finch. I'm going to read portions of it into the record. She cleared her throat and began. To whatever court may be reviewing this matter. My name is Elias James Brennan, and I write this in sound mind and body to explain my decisions regarding my estate. I have chosen to leave everything I own to my distant cousins Thomas and Margaret Brennan. I make this choice not because they are my closest relatives, but because they are good people in a world that often punishes goodness. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Winters continued reading. I have observed Thomas and Margaret from a distance for many years. I attended their family gatherings. I watched how they sacrificed for their children. I saw their character tested and never broken. I also saw what their children became: entitled, ungrateful, willing to take without giving. I knew long before it happened that those children would eventually bleed their parents dry. And I knew that when they did, Thomas and Margaret would need help. Rachel's face had gone pale. Kyle stared at the floor. Emma covered her mouth with her hand. The judge continued, "My estate is substantial, $265 million by current estimates. I leave all of it to Thomas and Margaret with one condition. If any family members contest this will or attempt to claim guardianship, this letter shall be made public, and said family members shall be permanently barred from any benefit of my estate. Furthermore, I have established a trust that cannot be broken by any legal challenge. Thomas and Margaret are the sole trustees. Their decisions are final and binding." Judge Winters set the letter down and looked at Rachel, Kyle, and Emma. "Your cousin saw you coming from 20 years away." She turned to Gerald Thorne. "Counselor, your clients have no case. The medical evidence shows competency. The financial evidence shows abuse by your clients, not vulnerability to outside influence. And the testator's own words make his intentions crystal clear." She picked up her gavel. "The petition for guardianship is denied. Furthermore, I'm ordering the petitioners to pay all legal fees incurred by Thomas and Margaret Brennan in defending against this frivolous action." She paused. "And if I were you, I'd advise your clients that any further harassment of the Brennans could result in restraining orders and criminal charges." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. Case dismissed. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the Cedar Falls residents erupted in quiet applause. Dorothy was crying. Sheriff Whitaker nodded with satisfaction. Thomas pulled Margaret close, and she felt decades of tension drain from her body. Across the aisle, Rachel stood frozen, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. Kyle's face was red with rage and humiliation. Emma simply looked lost. Gerald Thorne gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eye contact. His clients followed him out of the courtroom in silence. Their opportunity for easy money vanished, their schemes exposed in public record. As they left, Margaret caught one final glimpse of Rachel's face. There was no remorse there, no shame, just cold calculation about what other angles might still be played. But it didn't matter anymore. The wall Elias had built around them had held. Outside the courthouse, under gray skies threatening rain, the Cedar Falls community gathered around Thomas and Margaret. Dorothy hugged them both. "Elias would be so proud," she said. Sheriff Whitaker shook Thomas's hand. "That judge saw right through them. You're safe now." Robert Kane pulled Thomas and Margaret aside. "This isn't completely over," he warned. "They could appeal, though they won't win. They could harass you in other ways, but legally, you're protected. The trust is solid. The judge's ruling is clear. You can finally move forward." That evening, back at the cabin, Thomas and Margaret sat by the fire with Mr. Finch and Patricia. The rain that had threatened all day finally came, drumming on the metal roof in a rhythm that felt almost celebratory. They'd won, not just the legal battle, but something more important. The right to live their lives without fear, without manipulation, without the constant weight of children who saw them only as resources to be extracted. But victory didn't erase the pain. Margaret stared into the flames and said quietly, "We lost our children today. Really lost them. Whatever was left after everything they did, it's gone now." Thomas took her hand. "We lost them years ago, Maggie. We just couldn't admit it until now." Patricia leaned forward. "The question now is what you do with what Elias gave you. You've got $265 million and a clear path forward. You can do anything, be anything, build anything." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a look, and in that look was everything they'd learned over the past months. About value and worth. About what mattered and what didn't. About the difference between taking and giving. between hoarding and building, between protecting yourself and helping others. "We've been talking," Thomas said. "We know what we want to do." Over the next 6 months, their vision took shape. Working with Patricia and a team of financial advisors, they established the Elias Brennan Foundation for Elder Justice. Its mission was simple but profound: to provide legal assistance, housing support, and financial education to elderly individuals who'd been victimized by family members or caregivers, to create safe spaces where people who'd lost everything could rebuild, to ensure that what had happened to Thomas and Margaret, and what nearly happened again when their children returned, wouldn't happen to others without recourse. They sold portions of the art collection through private sales and selective auctions, always working with reputable houses, always ensuring pieces went to collectors and museums that would preserve and share them. Each sale generated millions, and every dollar went into the foundation. They kept only what they needed to live comfortably, not extravagantly. The cabin remained their home. The simple life Elias had modeled remained their template. The property itself transformed. They hired architects to design a community center adjacent to the cabin, a beautiful timber structure that honored the forest while providing space for workshops, counseling sessions, and support groups. They brought in social workers and lawyers who specialized in elder law. They created a hotline for people facing financial abuse. They funded scholarship programs for professionals entering the field of elder advocacy. Dorothy became the foundation's historian, documenting stories of survivors and creating educational materials. Sheriff Whitaker joined the board, bringing law enforcement perspective to prevention strategies. The Cedar Falls community rallied, volunteering time and skills, proud that their small town had become the birthplace of something that mattered beyond their mountains. One afternoon in late spring, a woman named Helen arrived at the foundation center. She was 74, thin and worn, carrying everything she owned in 2 trash bags. Her daughter had taken power of attorney and sold Helen's home, keeping the proceeds. Helen had been living in her car for 3 weeks before seeing a news story about the foundation. Margaret met her at the door and, without a word, pulled her into a hug. "We've got you," she whispered. "You're safe now." They helped Helen file legal action against her daughter. They connected her with housing. They got her medical care and counseling. 6 months later, Helen had her own apartment. Her daughter was facing criminal charges, and Helen had begun volunteering at the foundation, helping other women who arrived with trash bags and broken hearts. One survivor helping another. One life rebuilt, helping to rebuild others. This was what Elias's fortune was meant for. By the end of the first year, the foundation had helped 237 people. By the end of the second year, that number had grown to over 800. News stories spread. Other states began modeling similar programs. Lawyers called asking how to replicate the legal framework. Donations poured in from people who'd experienced similar betrayals or who simply believed elderly people deserved protection and dignity. Thomas spent his days working with the construction crew, building tiny homes on the property where survivors could live while getting back on their feet. His hands, still shaking slightly from the stroke, found purpose in every nail hammered and every board cut. Margaret ran the support groups, her own story giving hope to people who thought they'd never recover from what family had done to them. Together, they'd created something that would outlive them, something that honored Elias's gift by multiplying it exponentially. They heard nothing from Rachel, Kyle, or Emma for 2 years. Then, one autumn afternoon, Michael appeared at the cabin door. He looked different, thinner, older, but his eyes held something new, clarity maybe, or humility. "Can we talk?" he asked. Thomas wanted to say no. Margaret could see it in his face, the instinct to protect themselves from more hurt. But she nodded and let Michael in. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so many important conversations had happened. Michael didn't make excuses. He told them he'd spent 2 years in therapy, working through why he'd felt entitled to their money, why he'd been willing to hurt them for it. He'd cut off contact with his siblings. He'd gotten a job and started paying back every dollar they'd given him, sending money orders with no return address, expecting nothing in return. "I can't undo what I did," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I can't give you back the years you lost or the pain we caused, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what you built here, what you're doing with Grandpa Elias's gift, and it's everything I wasn't. Generous instead of greedy, giving instead of taking, healing instead of hurting." He looked at them both. "I'm proud to be your son. I just wish I'd figured that out before I stopped deserving to be." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. She didn't offer full forgiveness because some wounds run too deep for that. But she offered something. The truth that people can change, that redemption is possible, that bridges burned can sometimes be rebuilt, not to what they were, but to something new. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's a start." Thomas nodded slowly. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. Michael stayed for an hour, meeting some of the foundation staff, seeing what his grandparents had built. When he left, he hugged them both. "Thank you for not giving up on the idea that people can be better, even when we give you every reason to." As his truck disappeared down the mountain road, Thomas turned to Margaret. "Do you think he means it this time?" Margaret watched the dust settle. "I think he's trying. Whether that's enough, we'll see. But I'm glad we didn't turn him away. Elias gave us a second chance. Maybe we can give Michael one too." 5 years after the court hearing, on a crisp October morning, they held a dedication ceremony for the Elias Brennan Memorial Garden on the foundation property. It was a quiet space with paths winding through native plants, benches for reflection, and a stone monument inscribed with Elias's words from his final letter. "In a world of takers, remain givers. In a time of greed, maintain integrity. Build something that outlasts you." Over 300 people attended. Survivors who'd been helped by the foundation, community members from Cedar Falls and beyond, lawyers and social workers who'd joined the cause. Dorothy gave a speech about Elias's quiet generosity. Sheriff Whitaker spoke about justice, and then Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady, her eyes clear. "5 years ago, my husband and I had nothing. We'd been betrayed by the people we loved most. We were living in poverty, abandoned and forgotten. Then a man we barely knew gave us everything. Not just money, but dignity. Not just property, but purpose." She paused, looking at Thomas. "We could have hoarded what he gave us. We could have lived in luxury and ignored the world, but that wouldn't have honored him. It wouldn't have honored what he saw in us." She gestured to the building behind her, to the tiny homes, to the people gathered who'd been helped and healed. "This is what $265 million looks like when it's used right. Not mansions, not yachts, not things that decay and disappear. This is legacy. This is love made practical. This is proof that even in our darkest moments, goodness can find us if we're brave enough to accept it and generous enough to pass it on." The crowd erupted in applause. Thomas stood beside her, and together they cut the ribbon on the memorial garden. As people filed through, reading Elias's words and sitting on benches made from timber cleared from his own land, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete. Not because of what they owned, but because of what they'd given away. Not because of wealth accumulated, but because of lives restored. That evening, as the last visitors left and the sun set over the mountains, Thomas and Margaret walked through the garden alone. They stopped at the stone monument, running their fingers over the carved letters. Thomas spoke first. "Do you think he knew? When he left us everything, do you think he knew we'd do this?" Margaret smiled. "I think he hoped. I think he trusted. And I think that trust was his greatest gift, not the money. The belief that we were capable of something better." They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged, more stars than seemed possible, scattered across the Montana sky like promises kept. The cabin behind them glowed with warm light. The foundation building stood solid and purposeful. The tiny homes sheltered people rebuilding their lives. And somewhere in the forest, in the trees Elias had loved and the land he'd protected, his presence seemed to linger. Not as a ghost, but as an echo of integrity, a reminder that one life lived with purpose could ripple forward forever. Margaret thought about her children. Rachel, Kyle, and Emma had disappeared entirely, their attempts to claim what wasn't theirs leading nowhere, their schemes exposed, their relationships burned. She felt sadness for what they'd become, but no longer guilt. She'd done her best. They'd made their choices. Michael was trying, slowly rebuilding trust through actions rather than words. That was enough for now. Maybe someday it would be more, maybe not. Either way, her worth wasn't defined by her children's choices anymore. Thomas pulled her close. "We did it, Maggie. We took something broken and built something beautiful." She leaned against him, feeling the strength that had never left despite everything they'd endured. "We did what Elias knew we would. We gave others what was given to us. A second chance. Hope. Proof that the end of one story can be the beginning of another." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, their steps slow but steady. Two people in their late 70s who'd survived betrayal and loss, and had somehow found not just survival, but meaning. The foundation would continue long after they were gone. The tiny homes would shelter generations of survivors. The legal aid program would protect thousands from the kind of abuse they'd experienced. And all of it traced back to one quiet man in the woods who'd seen something worth protecting in two people the world had overlooked. As they settled into their chairs by the fire, Margaret picked up the photograph Dorothy had given them years ago. Young Elias standing in front of this very cabin, his eyes holding that peaceful expression they'd come to understand. She traced the frame with her finger. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing us when no one else did, for believing we were worth saving, for trusting us with something that mattered." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. And in that moment, Thomas and Margaret Brennan understood something profound. Wealth isn't measured in dollars or assets or things that can be counted and taxed. It's measured in lives touched, in dignity restored, in the space between taking and giving where humanity lives. They'd been given $265 million. But what they'd really been given was the chance to prove that goodness still existed, that integrity still mattered, that two ordinary people could do something extraordinary if they simply had the courage to choose right over easy, giving over taking, and legacy over luxury. Anyone can inherit a fortune, but it takes wisdom to know what to do with it, courage to stand against those who would take it, and grace to use it for something bigger than yourself. As dawn broke over the Montana mountains years later, Thomas and Margaret Brennan, now in their 80s, stood on the porch of the cabin Elias had built. Below them, the foundation campus had grown to include 3 buildings, 20 tiny homes, a community garden, and a medical clinic. Over 5,000 people had been helped in the decades since they'd opened. Laws had changed in 4 states because of their advocacy work. Families had been held accountable, survivors had been empowered. They'd never become famous. They'd turned down countless interview requests, preferring their work to speak for itself. They lived simply in the cabin, taking only what they needed, giving away everything else. The art collection that remained had been donated to museums with plaques crediting Elias Brennan's vision and Thomas and Margaret's stewardship. The final pieces would fund the foundation for another 50 years after they were gone. Margaret looked at Thomas, his hair white now, his hands steady again after years of purposeful work. "We did good, didn't we?" He smiled, pulling her close. "We honored him, we honored us, and we proved something important." "What's that?" "That family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up, who protects, who believes. Elias was more family to us in death than our own children were in life." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. And now we're family to hundreds of people who had nowhere else to turn. They stood together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, two elderly people who'd lost everything and been given a second chance, not through luck, but through the deliberate choice of a man who understood that true wealth is recognizing worth in others. The woman who'd once sorted coins to buy groceries, and the man who'd once fixed engines with shaking hands, had become guardians of something far more valuable than money. They'd become proof that betrayal doesn't have to break you, that loss doesn't have to define you, and that sometimes the greatest fortunes are found not in what you keep, but in what you give away. Because for Thomas and Margaret Brennan, the log cabin that had seemed like a last resort had become a launching pad for miracles. The vault that had held $265 million had become a wellspring of hope, and the family that had betrayed them had been replaced by a family of survivors who understood that love isn't about entitlement or obligation. It's about choosing to show up, choosing to help, choosing to believe that broken people can be made whole again if someone simply cares enough to try. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances. Click to ride with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some dreams are meant to be rebuilt.